Hi, I'm Mark Zug. For my workshop in traditional mediums, I'm going to show you how I painted this painting, Space Lift. Now it's about an hour of video, and that means it's 1/40th of the time I spent on the piece, but it'll be a little taste anyway. So let's get started. Now, as I'm doing the underpainting in very thin paint, the very early stages of the painting, I'm approaching it much like one would approach an ink brush drawing, something with very thin ink, and that's actually what the paint feels like at this point. It feels not at all like oil paint. It feels like watercolors. It's very much very dilute, almost like a sumi brush painting. These brushes that I've found, which are the Winsor & Newton Monarchs, they are synthetic brushes. They've been on the market for quite a while, but they are really good for especially this stage and almost every other stage. If a brush is too stiff, then it doesn't respond to the fine detail. You know, the little lines will get messed up. And if the brush is too supple, too floppy, then it doesn't create any abruptness, any of the sharp edges that you might want. And then when you want to pillow it out, to push in on the brush and push out all that paint, create large shapes, a very soft brush will yield you a very vague shape. But the Winsor & Newton long filberts do just fine for this. So as you can see, I'm just creating a nice monotone wash drawing in this mixture of paint. It's mostly raw umber, and I just mix it with a lot of solvent. Not much oil at this point. I don't want a lot of oil in the paint because I want the dried layer to be on the brittle side, not on the oily side, because it's the foundation of all the other layers to come. At the points where I might want to warm it up a little, I just add a little burnt sienna in there and treat it the same way. It's basically iron oxide, like most of the other earths. It dries about the same rate as the other earths and umbers and ochres. That's Winsor & Newton's burnt sienna. A good warmer upper. I've used it forever. Very nice color. I'm going to flesh out this rhino in monochrome. At this point, you can see me going in there with all that burnt sienna, and the brush might not be so wet this time. The sumi type painting with very dilute paint, that has its place, but it's equally as important to use the options open to a dry brush with oil paint. And what I'm doing now is alternating between dry and wet, between pigmented and unpigmented. I'll get a lot of wash, get a lot of pigment and a lot of solvent on the brush, and then I'll go down and I'll dry the brush up, or I'll just paint out until the brush exhausts itself and becomes dry, where I'm ducking out of the frame half the time. What I'm doing is wiping the paint dry on the paper towel so that I have the right moisture level, if you will, solvent level on the brush. And very instinctually erasing with the solvent and painting in, and just using those color shifts. The colors, the temperature of the colors shifting all the time, especially since I've got some raw umber going, and I've got some burnt sienna, I've got that black. All those are very different color temperature earths. So it's all an instinctual process of blending what I have on there, using the solvent to re-suspend or re-dissolve paint that's already been put down, and moving other paint that's around, that's already there, moving it around, and blending other paint with dry brush, creating washes with a wet brush. As you can see, it's kind of fast, and it gives a very nice base, a monochrome drawing to paint on later. I'm going to zoom in here, zoom in on this guy, get a closer look at how I'm using the solvent to erase features in the paint that's already laid down. There's almost no pigment on the brush at all at this point. It's just all solvent, just a big wet solventy brush. And I'm just using the erase function of a solventy brush to erase back to the light gray ground on which I'm working. This way of working is just as important and just as valid as putting paint on. As every painter knows, you work light onto dark just as often as you work dark onto light. The two ways complement each other, and as you dissolve paint that's been laid down, you'll get temperature shifts. Erasing these toenails, and you can see they're getting a little cool. That'll work very nicely. And as the temperature shifts, and sometimes unexpectedly, takes me by surprise, but like in real life, there is warm and there is cool, and there is surprise to the eye. But all these things that I'm doing are not going to be wasted, even though they are the underlayer. That's the beauty of oil paint. It's translucent, and all these wonderful shifts in color and these found contours and these found textures, they will all come through in the finish in some form. Now, what I'm doing right now is just rifling my mind and rifling the reference in front of me, which is probably a Google image of a woolly rhino reconstruction or something like that, making sure that it looks true and I've got the anatomy indicated correctly. Make sure I'm always keeping an eye on the shadows, the cast shadow on the ground that I've indicated in the sketch, and making sure that the direction of the light is consistent. Where I'm erasing highlight portions of that fur, I'm making sure that the light, which is coming from the upper right, about the 1 to 2 o'clock position on the clock, is consistent and is going to actually be creating those highlights as we see them. Like little planets, every little bump has its own light side and dark side. Furry creatures exploit the qualities of oil paint very well. There's a lot of chaos in that fur. And here's a shot of the paint itself. As you can see, the mixture is just really very watery, except it's very solventy, not very watery, just really wet. Like a watercolor brush, like a huge watercolor mop brush. I'm just covering as much area as possible right now. You can even start to see it drip there. Sometimes you can use that to effect if you want. But right now my goal is just to mop the surface with a lot of oil paint. You can use turpentine to dilute the paint too. I use odorless solvent just for health reasons. When all this solvent evaporates off, what it does is leave the oil paint behind in an extremely thin layer, a very well rinsed residue of thin oil paint with the linseed oil so rinsed out and spread out that it's just a very, very dry and thin, unelastic layer of paint. Just like if you would pave a driveway and use a lot of gravel and only a little bit of tar, it would be a very dry and inelastic paving job. And that's what you want here, because you don't want something that's going to swell and move and deform and disrupt the paint layers of paint that's on top of them. You want a very stable bed, a foundation. So this plays right into that plan. Don't add oil right now, just solvent, and you'll set yourself up well for piling as much paint as you want on later. Okay, here I'm going to be incorporating the drawing in a thin layer of paint, showing you how the pencil line changes as the wet paint comes onto it. I'm just going to be freehanding these beasts here and grossening that pencil line. What happens when the solvent hits the graphite is the graphite becomes another color of paint, another color and temperature of black. It becomes carbon black, and the pencil line then is moved, and some grossening happens. The contours become thicker. The line stops looking like a pencil line, more like a sort of a brush line, or just something between a brush and a pencil, a blotter-like texture to the line. And it's nice to have this extra density that the brush can touch and sort of make it darker, or wherever it touches adds a little beef to the wash drawing. Here we're going to continue to create very large shapes with this underpainting. Now the upper half of this spaceship, for this I use a very large moppy brush filled with a lot of dilute paint once again. But here you can start to see how I can suggest some hard, regular technical detail without a lot of fuss, just by using the paintbrush's natural edge and the rhythm of the hand to create a repetitive figure, which I'm ultimately going to use in the finished painting. There's a design on the underside of this spaceship that is extremely regular and technical, which you can begin to indicate in the underpainting, which, even though you're going to cover it up, again, not totally, because oil paint is translucent. At every stage, the quality of the underpainting is important. So no details really wasted here. I'm acting as if this really is the painting. This wash drawing is the thing I'm going to turn in, as if I'm going to turn in an illustration of a certain style. So I want to make sure it's complete and correct in terms of value and contour and everything. Once again, just freehanding all these curves. Now when you're doing the central figures, not surprisingly, you want to buckle down and firm up a lot of detail in there, even though it's an underpainting. These fellas are at the high contrast point of the composition. They are silhouetted against a strong light, and they are dark figures, and there's going to be a lot of detail around their edges. So I'm using thin brushes, but the strategy is much the same as with the thicker, moppier brushes. You can see me poking in and out of the frame. I'm looking at my drawing. I've got my drawing up to the left, and I'm studying it to make sure that I'm doing at least a better drawing in paint than I've already done in pencil. Just softening it up with a bit of dry brush and then going back in with the pigment, and then putting a little wet in and going back in with the back and forth with the wet, with the dry, with the pigmented brush, with the unpigmented brush, using a watercolorish technique to create all this foundation for the layers to come. Now, what you don't hear is what I'm playing in the background, which is either music or audio podcasts or audio books or what have you. It's just my personal way of working, detaching my audio brain from my visual brain. It's what I've always done since forever. Now, I'm doing a portrait, essentially, of this lead fellow, the guy who's uppermost in the composition. Or you could say that he's the subordinate figure because the woman is forwardmost in the composition, whichever you like. But one thing I really love about this composition is that I've intentionally set up this extreme light and dark contrast, because you've got sunlit ground silhouetting these people with very dark skin. And that's essentially the only illumination they have, is the light coming up from that ground. Hence, what I'm doing to his face is a diffuse light that you would see if you were facing these figures before a large lit doorway, and all the light were coming at you and practically none from your direction. The light would all be a very glancing, very harsh light, accentuating the hard edges, the craggy details of these figures, all the most harsh, unflattering, and most interesting lights. Now proceeding over to the clothing on these characters, I've got furs on this guy. I'm going to use a not quite as wet brush to draw out some individual fur strands, individual points along his contour, and push some density down into it. At the same time, creating a nice warm underbelly for the overpainting on that fur stole or toga that he's got on. Now, as I put increasingly dense shadows in here, I'm using less and less solvent because, of course, the more dilute the paint, the less density it has. But these people are at the center of the deepest darks in the picture. So I'm going to want to pile in some pretty dense paint. Now, it's not totally straight from the tube. There is still a lot of solvent in there, but it's definitely the densest paint I've been using so far. Now you can see that I've used the edge of the brush up in the faces, and I've created a lot of detail already, a lot of suggestive detail. No, it's not finished quality, but it's suggestive and certainly a good foundation to build on. And I'm doing the same in the garments, in the creases of the fur. All the places that are dark are going to be dark in the painting, and all the places that are light are going to be light in the painting. This is important because that way you build as much luminosity into the work as possible. Now you may wonder why I'm expending so much time and trouble on the underpainting that I'm just going to paint over. And that is the reason, that the foundation for it, for the overpainting, is sort of a light mask. It's just like when you're painting a room and you try to paint a flat color over top of, say, wallpaper where there's a pattern. You need several coats to even get that pattern to disappear. Well, this is that pattern, and if you build on that pattern with translucent paint that's to come, you create a beautiful finished effect, and you've already amped up your contrast in the very beginning, so you don't have to do double duty with your later paint layers. Even down to the spear, I'm being very careful to create straight edges and create a good detail count, so that there's less work to do when I paint wet into wet. When I paint this spear, the nature of the brush creates a nice rounded effect all by itself. The belly of the brush creates a hazy line on one side, and then on the opposite sides of the line you have the brush tips creating that hard outer contour. Anytime you slant your brush, you can create that effect. The tip creates the hard edge, and the belly, which is towards you, creates the softer, hazier side. Now, as you see, I've got this figure grouping pushed into pretty good detail. It's still kind of vague, and you'll be able to see later on I'm going to actually do a little bit of revision to at least one of the figures. something that I try to keep to a minimum because, as I said, the underpainting creates a beautiful masking effect that I want to maximize the paint power, the luminosity power for the finished paint. But it's unavoidable. Sometimes you just have to revise things that you thought you had carved into the painting at the early stage. Right now, doing the lead woman in the figure, being very careful not to ruin those very sharp highlight edges at the front of the faces. Because if I do ruin them, if I do go over the line, then have to erase and sop up that line, it's never going to come 100% back to the bright gray that was down. There'll always be a little stain left there. So this is a very important contrast area, so I'm being kind of careful. Right now I'm using a lot of Mars black mixed with a bit of alizarin crimson. That's my rosy black. It's my go-to darkening for my underpainting. Right now you can see that that slanted brush technique I was talking about, where I just create a belly edge and then a sharp edge at the tip. As I go around, the temperature of the wash that I'm creating changes as I go. It sometimes surprises me. Sometimes it warms up, cools off, as light does in real life. It kind of keeps me on my toes, not knowing exactly what the paint's going to do, but more or less knowing. Right here, I'm checking the reference very carefully. I want to make sure that I've got those shadows of the forehead, the eyelid, and the nostril flare all in the place they should go. Now, as for what I'm looking at my drawing mainly. I have a couple photos around the easel, which you can't see, just clippings of reference that is very inexact. There's some African tribes people here and there, and this and that. And the reason I'm not showing the reference is it is extremely inexact. It does not resemble the painting at all. And everything goes into the head before it comes out to the brush. So there's nothing except the drawing, really, that I'm, it could be said that I'm copying. Trying to copy my drawing as accurately as I can. The reference is there just as a kind of a Greek chorus to keep me on track. I do love doing long, scraggly hair in oil wash, dreadlocks, and hair like that. It's just it's so well suited. And when you have a kind of a rough, like almost a drywall texture, like the texture of your wall at home if it's drywall and painted. That's the texture of the gray oil ground that I'm working on. And then when you put dilute oil paint on top of that with a lot of solvent on, it falls into all those little pebbly textures and creates a nice roughness that can really work for you when you want to multiply detail. Just multiply detail on the fly by creating the overall line and then letting the detail scattering sort of fractal it out. You can see I can kind of push the paint around once it's down. There's a lot I can do with it. It's not dead in the water once it's down. That's the wonderful thing about oil paint. You work even at this wash stage. It doesn't behave like watercolors. If you hit a dense patch of oil paint, it will smear out and begin to behave like the more opaque oil paint. In the photographic step-by-step, you've seen me put on the very early stages of the opaque paint. Now you'll see the paint I've put on and how I'm going to use the rubber tool to carve out areas of that opaque paint. It's never too early to create the correct detail, and given that this is pretty thick paint, much of this detail will stay till the very end. Won't be overworked too much. This is an old tool called the Kemper Wipe Away tool, and I've had to put it in a different holder because it became detached from its original wood handle. So, but it's got a very nice firmness, not too soft, not too stiff, a firm rubber feel to it, and it's doing exactly what you can see. It's just pushing away areas of the paint. Pushing back, in this case, back to dark, although I can also use it to push back to white if I'm using a dark paint. And in the case of fur, the texture of hair, the texture of the striations of natural fabrics, it's extremely helpful and just a heck of a lot of fun to go in there where you thought you've already put paint in. Just finesse it a little more with a rigid tool. Now you can see I'm going up out of the frame a little there, so I won't describe that, but the same thing applies. Now using much denser paint, less dilute, I'm going to go in and push up the darks to their final density. This is about as dark as it's going to get in this area of the painting, and I feel confident in the shade of the dark. All the finesse is going to be in the midtones and lights, and the darks are going to mass together. So dark blackish brown, that's basically the shadow side of this rhino. So I'm going to push all those darks to their finished density. It's got less solvent than I used, so the oil paint, or rather the linseed oil in the oil paint, is ruling its texture and not the watery, very liquid solvent. I'm pushing those little crevices into the already established fur, the heavy opaque whites that I've put down. Next thing I'm going to show you some dry brush, and this is using a Badger blender, one of the Lange brushes I have. I use it completely dry. If I've got a lot of paint on the surface, a lot of dense color, but the texture is just a little too jagged, I use some of those dry hair ends on the brush to just wisp away some of that very hard texture, some of the hard edges that I've put in. As a consequence of working, you will just put in edges and textures that don't necessarily complement the subject. So after you do that, it's a good finishing stage to take a dry brush and get rid of the hard edges, kind of like sanding off the edges of a cabinet if you're a cabinet builder, or filing off the edges of a piece of metal if you work in metals. Just the same kind of smoothing, deburring, sanding, finishing. This time with a dry brush. When my brush goes off screen, it's because I have a paper towel and I'm drying it. I'm making sure that there's no oil, there's no paint on the brush. It's just completely dry bristles. And that creates that lovely blended oil paint effect that we all associate with oil paint. So basically, once I finish these blending, this one rhino will be finished, even though you can see the painting around it is really just completely unfinished. But sometimes it's important to finish a point and use that as inspiration for the next thing. So you don't always have to go in stages, and you don't always have to do one thing at a time. You can do both. You saw in the photographic step-by-step me laying down the large areas of color. And now this one needs some extra detail in the shadow. It needs some variegation in the tundra surface. There are some dark areas of vegetation set against the lighter grasses, so I want to express those. But those will be a macro shape, a large shape, a continent, if you will. And at this point, I'm just creating that continent and creating the texture. So at this point, it's just really rough. Just a bunch of blue shadow and then some rust colored paint, some burnt sienna, some burnt umber, some black with alizarin crimson mixed with it. And this is pretty much paint either in the consistency it comes out of the tube, or a little bit cut with some refined linseed oil to glide easier. And I'm using brights, which are square-shouldered brushes. Now here I'm using a filbert to push in a lot of rust-colored paint. The brights, the square-shouldered brushes, are good for short, abrupt strokes, and they tend to leave hard edges in the paint. That's good for texture, especially if you're painting grasses, which I'm painting right now. Now I'm going to be mixing up some paint that brings the color of the tundra grasses into a little more realism. Again, I'm not being so careful with violating the contours of my underpainting right now. It's not all that accurate. Mixing up something like that, yogurt, a yogurt color. If your yogurt happens to be ochre, it's sort of an olive color to warm things up, not have them so purple. So you can see as I push that ochre colored paint into there, it's now creating a nice 3-colored effect and not a 2-color effect. Anytime you can get more than 2 colors working against each other, it's always richer. So these tundra grasses, if you've ever seen photographs of the tundra, it's there's a lot of reds, yellows, startling kind of lime greens. That's why I painted the sunlit portion of the grass as such a shocking pale yellow, because sometimes the grasses are just incredibly colorful, much more than just gray or green or brown like a meadow. But the tundra, the cold weather, maybe the hostile environment tends to bring out some extreme coloration in the plant life there. Whatever that is, it's something I'm trying to reflect. I'm trying to make it look colorful. You see that I've got some red stuff up there in the sunlit portion, and right here I'm trying to make it look like that stuff is continuous with the darker continents of rust-colored, ochre-colored grasses that continue into the shadow. The shadow being cast, of course, by the immense spaceship that the protagonists are riding in. And right now, I'm not really looking at any reference, except maybe to get some shadow color temperature. Maybe if I have a photograph of grassland, there's some differential sunlight and shadow there. But mostly now it's just sort of using my mental, my visual memory to make sure it looks like shadow and not like something dark spilled on the ground. And to break up the shadow, you see all these different colors I'm putting in there, making sure that no color rules too much of that area, always breaking it up, putting in texture. We're going to zoom in, get into some detail here. I've begun to create more detail in this fellow's face. Again, the zoom is far past the resolution of the camera, so it's kind of a hazy picture, but you can see where the brush contacts the work, and you can see what happens to the color as the brush goes across it. And right now, I'm using sienna and umber oil paint pretty much as it comes from the tube, plus a little refined linseed oil. And taking it very slowly. You can see the lens I'm using just to get a nice big picture in there to so that I don't have to strain my eyes to see what I'm doing. I'm just taking the dark paint that I've laid down earlier that you may have seen in the photographic step-by-step, and I'm softening the edges, the light, the dark edges, usually with very high hot temperature paint, some sort of umber sienna mixture that creates some warmth, and just laying that warm paint right at the intersection of a light and a dark to create a sort of an effect of the light coming around the limb of his cheek or his chin. Continuing to address the terminator, that line from light to shadow that moves across the face, that area that borders the light and the shadow, that defines the shape of a thing, that tells your eye how far out it projects, that tells you what its texture is, the thing the material is made of. It's a very important area. Again, softening those beard contours and pushing extra dense paint into the black inside of his neck area, just deepening all the crevices. It's important to note that none of the dark paint is very thick. All this dark paint is extremely flat to the board. There's no brush relief, and if there is any, I take it out. Occasionally, there may be a dried brush mark underneath of what I'm doing, and you'll see a little later that I get rid of that. With the light paint that you've seen me put down in the photographic step-by-step, my rule is dark's thin, light's thick. I'm repositioning the lens so that I can see everything a little better. These lenses are just clamp-on lenses you can buy from Dick Blick. I'm working on the highlight side, and I'm not going to apply the absolute brightest highlights just yet. Just I'm making sure that his skin has a nice, not too rough, not too smooth texture, and continuing to lay that sienna in there. Now, the thing I'm looking at is largely internal. I've absorbed a lot of the reference on the various people that I've based these tribesmen on, and there's nothing I'm copying at this point. I'm going off internal data. Okay, here's that tool. There's a little rough spot, a little excrescence dried into the oil layer right there where it's inconvenient to paint around. So I take a print scraper and I literally just scrape it right off and scrape it flat again, then continue with my painting. The triangular print scraper is very handy. I've used it quite a lot. It's come in extremely handy over the years. I've had it since art school, and it's gonna last me for centuries. Getting in there with the eye I'm going on an intuitive sense of how much of the eye will be lit, how much of the eye facing the light will be lit, and then how much of the other eye that's in the shadow will be lit, because you might have an eyelid projecting into the light or you might not. So I think maybe I try it. I try a little light. If it looks like too much, I paint it back out again. So this is all an instinctual construction of a face. Putting in some very light highlight on the lip. This is about the lightest color that will go on the face, a very light yellowish, cream colored, cream to ochre color. And I'm pretty happy with the face. Onto the hair and the other contours. And I'm going to create the final color for the fur garment. I've got some cool, rosy, burnt umber mixture that I'm working into this right now, and there's already some dark wet paint that has been laid down. So I'm picking some of that up as I put on the thicker strokes. The crevasses, the dark crevasses, are left in there. The light strokes are picking up the highlights. At this point, I'm not really sure exactly what the shape of his garment's going to be. I'm just sort of winging it right now. I don't want it to look too much like the classic cartoon caveman, something going over his shoulder, but he's the only one of the group that's wearing a garment like this, so I'm not treading in too many tropes to give him sort of a fur toga thing. I think I want to put a clasp or some sort of bone something up on his shoulder, so I'm going to be careful up there, not lay too much heavy paint in, leave my options opened up there while I decide what to do with that. The nice thing about oil paint is it's practically made to do hair of all kinds, appropriate because there's hair in brushes and there's also oil in animals' fur. So the combination of oil and hair is very natural in the medium, and it also happens to be very well suited to rendering it on a painting. So I noticed that some of that fur texture, I've just left the raw strokes float out there on the outer contours. Much of that will get left till the finish, and that will endure. And right now it's got a kind of a scraggly texture that I like, so I'm probably not going to fool with it too much. You notice on my right is that stick that you always see that I'm leaning my hand up against. That's my homemade maul stick. It looks kind of like a T-square, but rests on the T end and is about a yard or a meter long, and it just slides back and forth in the tray of the easel. Now pushing this thin but still dense oil paint into the shadows. This I'm going to relieve later with a little bit of lighter paint as I bring out some detail on his thigh or whatever garment he has happening down there between his legs. So here's some extra dark pushing up into the fur, the crevasses in the fur. At this point, I'm probably fooling around with something, deciding what I'm going to do up where his garment is clasped. There's a bone thingamajig, I'm sure of it. A lot of chaos in these hair textures, in these fur textures. He's got something wrapped around his waist. He's got a utility belt, I guess, a leather thong. Okay, now we're going to start relieving this black wedge of space that I've painted. Going to define his leg, his body posture, what he's wearing. And you'll also see how I'm going to bring in the gray ambient light that gives the shadow side of his skin some tone and texture. This off-frame light that he's getting through the doorway of the spaceship is bringing in that wonderful gray that he has. His skin is so dark that he's got almost a bluish tinge to it, so that I'm free to use very cool grays to create his skin texture. And since that is a leg, he's going to have some daylight coming through there too. This wedge of space that I've made, this black space, needs a little bit of a little peekaboo light coming in under his shin. This color is the same color as the background, the same whitish yellow. I only need to pay attention to the contours of that light, not really put any modeling into it. Now we're going to spell out the rear part of the garment here, and it's probably pretty much to its finished color. I'm liking the honey color that it makes when I put it over the light background, so I'm not going to play with it too much. It's going to have a belt or something, so I'm going to lay a little dark color as a base for this belt, some strap holding his fur in place, and then I'm going to use the wipeout tool to scrape it back, give the belt a little light color. Once again, just use the underpainting tone. And right now, I'm probably looking a lot at the drawing to make sure I'm expressing his body language right. So I'm doing a lot of looking off frame right now to check my reference, to check the original pose, make sure I'm not doing something weird, make sure I like the shape of his garment. He's pretty near the edge of the painting, so I also want to make sure that he's not creating any awkward intersections with the border of the painting, nothing that's going to draw the eye's attention unnecessarily to the edge. Moving towards the center of the painting once again, and we're beginning to create some dense stuff in these figures. Now, before I narrate too much about what I'm doing, I want to draw your attention to the center figure, the adolescent girl who's got her chin buried in the shoulder of the woman. If you'll remember, I was going to redo her. I was going to revise her. I had indicated that some minutes ago. And here is, in fact, what I've done with her hair. I wanted to give her some more structured hairdo, not just a shapeless mass that she had. So I took inspiration from the Himba people who live in Namibia in Africa, and the young girls wear an interesting two-horned hairstyle, the horns coming front over their face. So I flipped it around, made it a backwards set of horns. Who knows what the young girls wore in Ice Age Africa, but it looks more interesting in silhouette than the unstructured mass of hair that I had. So I didn't video record that alteration, but you can see some of its stages in the photographic step-by-step. And now what I'm doing to this woman's arm is I'm putting on some medium density paint, pretty much paint as it comes out of the tube, a mixture of sienna, raw umber, and some transparent gold ochre, and a little tiny bit of white, and creating a nice graduated paint mass that I can then smear around with the brush. Again, paying a lot of attention to warm up the limb of the arm as it rolls around. And you can see I'm looking off to the right, and probably my reference is is an African woman whose arm is roughly bent in the same way. But I can remember the reference I used in. It wasn't lit in the right fashion. So what I'm drawing from that photograph is mostly muscle structure, anatomy, and making sure that that my mind's eye is seeing the bump outs where the bump outs actually occur on a real woman's arm. And you'll see I'm just about to carve in some highlights, and these highlights are totally a product of the mind, because I'm mapping three-dimensional information from that photograph and then in my mind applying a highlight to it, sort of an internal 3D program, and then putting that highlight onto the arm where I guess the highlight would actually be. The reference photo does not contain the highlights that you're seeing right now. So my hand's in the way, but I have to get my hand up into the right position to make those various strokes. And the problem I'm solving is the same as the problem of the man's face, and that is to capture the glancing light and some realistic rounding of the form. And also here you'll see in a second I'm going to start tucking some warm lights right on top of that limb there where the light curves around into the shadow. This warm light, it's a feature of their dark skin, and the rich color that the extremely bright light from the door brings out. It's not going to be the only color, as you'll see. You can see I've got some cools already worked into the skin of the girl who's there at her back, and I'll be doing that in just a few minutes. But right now I want to make sure that I have the I guess it would be a 1/5 light coming from the door, accurately drawing the form of her arm. I want to maybe talk a little about the outfits that I've chosen. I won't be getting too much into the outfits during the narrated part of this demo, but I did do some research on what they think people of the Ice Age might have worn, and their innovation over simple skins was the sewn tube, which they could use for arms and legs, and their clothing was nowhere tailored like ours is today. The clothes that, for instance, was found on Otzi the Iceman in the Alps was a couple of leggings held in place by garter-like straps and something resembling a poncho. And these would be the kind of things that I imagine our Ice Age people would be wearing. They would be wearing what the technology of their day allowed them to make out of animal skins, and they would be more or less ponchos and leggings, tubes for sleeves, and other things like that. So this is what I've chosen to array them in. Now you see that I just now started putting in some cool light on the back of her arm. This is a mixture of some French ultramarine, some white, and of course various earths to keep it on the gray side. But this light that I just put in is coming from roughly the direction of the viewer, but it's very weak and cold. It would be whatever skylight is in that direction that's peeking through the opening of the spaceship door. So that would be a minor light, and it would be used just to make the forms pop and to make them round. Even though it's a minor light, it does that very well. As you could see, as soon as I started to put it in, it just popped. And now I'm going to address her profile, her face, the lead woman in this composition. She's a rather important figure. I want to make sure that her face has a lot of character, and that she has the authority and the beauty I had imagined when I was doing the sketch. And right now, I'm taking that same light paint that I used on the arm and doing the same kind of 3D modeling on the face. I have a piece of reference which, if I remember correctly, was of a very young girl and didn't really resemble this woman. But I'm combining that with a couple other things from other sources to yield the character I want. And right now I'm addressing that all-important Terminator. It seems that in a lighting situation like this, doing that Terminator is most of the work because it creates most of the dimensionality. And you're going to see in just a couple of minutes how very important foreshortening is to an angle like this. You're expected to read her character. At the same time, she's mostly pointed away from you, and all the light is falling on the part of the face that's mostly out of your view. So her facial details that are her expressive details, the eyes, the mouth, the creases, all those are turned away. And it's really ultra important that they all are put in the right spot, because if they're not, if they can be off just a fraction of a millimeter here, and it'll look like a totally different person or a totally different expression. So you can see I'm being very careful and slow about this, about putting these highlights in. Sometimes I think that I rework the highlights or take them out if I've misapplied them. And you can also see that when you're foreshortening a face, it's good to study reference, because it's often not intuitive. There are creases where you don't expect creases are going to be. So slow down and really study the reference that you've got to work with, whatever that reference is. Now right here I'm putting that dark blotter line that often the Terminator possesses. This dark crease that we learned to do in drawing class that separates the light and the dark. And the reason for that is just that statistically, the area between the light and the secondary light, which is basically the dark side, is theoretically getting the least light of all. So it tends to have a kind of a thick blotter line of dark. And that, to the comic book artist, is exploited to great effect. Just put a thick dark line between your light and your shadow, and suddenly you've got dimensionality. So I'm putting a bit of that in her cheek, though careful not to overuse it, because I don't want it to become a visual trope. I want her cheekbone to look nice and prominent and sharp, and that's the only reason that I'm selectively creating higher contrast there. Again, laying in that very flat and liquid dark that's supposed to lay very flat to the surface of the painting. And to do that, I generally use the soft hair brushes. Here's where I really crack open the Kolinsky sables. Right now, I think I'm using a Winsor Newton Series 7, size 2. It's originally a watercolor brush, but it's served me very well ever since art school as my go-to detail brush of choice for oil paints. It's nice and resilient. The hair seems to hold up well. So I'm just making sure that the dark paint lays completely flat. And as you saw before, if I come upon any little jagged edges, I'll just shave them off with that scraper tool. It doesn't happen that often. That's why I sanded the work, the board, before I started to put the work on it. So I'm just laying all those supporting shadows in and making sure they've got the right warm temperature, and taking it very slow, studying the reference, making sure I have the right colors mixed up. And here I go with some of that skylight that you saw me putting in earlier on the back of her arm. A little bit of ultramarine blue, burnt umber, some white, some black, some raw umber. It's a variation. If you'd see it against a white surface, it would look almost like a very dark slate-like lavender. But in this context, it seems to reflect a blue sky that the viewer has just over his shoulder. Once again, I'm using this dirty brush that I just used for those cool shadows, and I'm going to use it to put in some of the similarly facing creases and contours in the front of her face, because those are facing back my way, the viewer's direction. They will be related to the color that I just used, so I'll use the brush still wet from those colors to do those. And again, paying very close attention to the foreshortening issues. Any of those creases could be misplaced by just a tiny amount, and the face would no longer work. Now I'm going to be addressing the shadow tones, and I'll be doing some interesting things and making some hard choices with respect to the progress I've made in those shadows. I'm going to be adjusting the color temperature of the shadow side of her cheek, the way that skylight has illuminated the flesh color, and ultimately the moisture content of her face. Right now it looks a little bit greasy, looks like a little very hard skylight is up there, and I want to get some uplight to warm the side of the chin and the cheek. So I'm using some burnt sienna for that. I'm engulfing those hard blotter terminator lines to make it look a little more natural. This is done with a short filbert, by the way. Here we go. I'm up there now. You see I've just kind of blurred out that highlight, but right away skin looks drier, and I tend to like what it's done to the color temperature and to the texture of the skin. So I don't mind having effaced that little highlight. I will go back in and pop it in if I need it to be sharper later. That's no problem. The main thing is having the base of the skin all the right shade and all the right color temperature, all the right tone, texture, and moisture, and all of that. Sharp highlights, specular highlights, they're easy to put in. Now we buckle down, really start rendering this face, really learn whether or not I can pull this expression out, whether I've gathered sufficient reference, whether I've got the right image in my head, and whether it's going to work. Now you see I'll put a detail down and then I'll stop, and what I'm doing is I'm looking off screen. I'm looking at my reference, which is 2 or 3 pictures that will become fused into one person, and taking a detail from this picture, rotating it in my internal 3D program, and then putting it on the painting. So there's a lot of processing that's happening right here, a lot of brain sweat. The way I've always worked with reference has always been this way. I've never even liked the process of getting exact reference. It's a favorite part of working for me to rotate this stuff in my mind and use very vague and inexact and tangential reference to create something that looks extremely specific. Now you see this crease that I've just put up above her eye. That's a thing that I'd spotted in the reference for the young girl, and it applies equally because of the lighting angle. So there's an example of the reference really doing its work in terms of being applying to global knowledge on these figures. Now I'm going to work on these beasts in this upper quadrant. These archaic buffalo-like creatures. They're not bison. They were a form native to Africa. They were gigantic water buffalo-like creatures that had immense horns, and they're a bit shaggy per my own liberty. I just imagined like the other megafauna that had the shaggy fur, the wool, like the mammoths and the rhino. Perhaps the giant water buffalo had a mane similar to an American bison. So that's just a leap of conjecture I took. And you can see just next to the ancient horses, which are pretty much exactly like modern horses except for the coloration, how very much larger they were than the water buffaloes and the bison of today. So right now I'm just putting the opaque paint right on top of the dark underpainting that I've previously established. You can see all these little specular highlights in the hindquarters of the creature. That's just glossy marks from the room lighting reflecting on that shiny black paint that's down. And so now I'm working light into dark, which is a very nice way of working because it kind of reminds me of black velvet painting a little bit. And there's a reason that craft artists ran away with black velvet painting so much. It's because it's a hell of a lot of fun. I love putting light on dark. It's kind of like a direct photon count way of painting, of applying color. Now I'm really gonna carve in those limbs. And as you see me work on these beasts up here, these as well as the horses, you'll see what an intricate play of contour these limbs are. They have to have their own body language. They have their own gestures. It's important to see that they're running and not just standing still at the same time. They can't all be running the same way or they look posed. So the same logic that compelled me to crop these beasts to have them not fit into the picture, to have them look unstable and kind of accidentally caught, uh, causes me to also shift their legs around a little bit, so they kind of look unstable. They look a little bit clumsy. And if you snapped a picture of beasts in motion, uh, they would be that way. So that's why that's informing my posing of these creatures. As for what I'm using for reference, I recall it was a very dim and distant aerial shot of some American bison in the Southwest, and just zeroing in on some body language is what I took from that photograph, and then I combined that with information on African water buffalo, and my usual grab bag of information comes together to form these. When I'm carving shapes like this, it's important that I also have the background colors mixed up and at the ready, not just the uh, colors for the forms, because those background colors they have to border the forms, and I use them just as surely as the local color to push those contours back and forth. I'm going to be doing these horses, and these horses are yet another thing where, of course, I didn't have any horses of this color, at this angle, running in this way. Um, they were ancient, which means they're not exactly like a Przewalski's horse, which I kind of based them a little bit on. In a couple more frames, you'll see that I've used a round mongoose blender on them, and I've blended the coat color out. But right now, I want to make sure there's enough paint on them to then blend. So I'm going back and forth and with the reference and making sure that I have enough burnt sienna worked into the back. Now you can see I've used the Badger blender on them. I've smoothed out all those contours. That also creates cross mixtures which gray up some of the tones, which makes it really lovely and pearl-like. You'll notice that when you blend with dry brush, it does tend to pearl the colors, and that's what happens when you blend colors that you've previously put side by side. There will be a lot of gray created accidentally. Some of those colors don't really want to be blended, so that when you cross mix them, when you blend them, you get a gray, you get mud. But that mud is beautiful because you've got mud here, you've got a very intense color there, then you've got a very warm color next to it, and it's all an interplay. So mud has its place. Right down there on the horse's flank, where the white flank turns away from the light, you see that it's got that gray happening. If it didn't have that gray, it would just look less rich. So in blending the horse out, I brought all these colors to the fore that I didn't notice initially. And now I can intentionally mix them and play with them. Now these horses have personalities, and they have a certain mood that they need to radiate, and they have facial expressions to reflect that mood. So I've gotten myself into that a little bit of a similar situation with these guys. Or they're turned away, and they've got a lot of the glancing contour issues that I addressed in the people. But that's important. This whole composition is full of creatures that are turned away from the viewer, and these horses are stampeding, presumably frightened out of their minds at this humongous spaceship that's drifting overhead. So much like these beautiful helicopter shots of the running beasts that are so beautiful. But if we heard the soundtrack, we'd hear the helicopter engine, and we'd realize that these beasts are really running in terror. And So these beasts here are just running scared from this apparition in the sky, and their faces have to kind of reflect that. So I've got a little personality work to do there, and so I'm drifting back and forth between the reference and the drawing, and making sure that some of the vigor of the drawing is still present when I add the extra information required to make it a fully rounded painting. So as I push color onto their faces, you can see they have several different coat colors on their faces. They've got the dark hair, they've got that mid-tone tan, and they've got the white. So even though I can sometimes give a subtle outline to a form to help define it against its background, in this case the horses are in a lot of motion, so it might be best just to have the background sort of interfering with their shapes a little bit. Now you can see I'm putting in the nostrils and the underside of their open mouths with a color that's probably just mostly straight burnt umber. Burnt umber is really good for taking dark and pushing it into a wet paint that you already have down, because it's a strong and dark color. It'll retain its character even though it's going into alien color. Another thing I'd like to point out with respect to these beasts and the space they occupy, that I unintentionally created a cave painting type of composition with a flattened aspect to all these animals, and their perspective plasters them up against their grassland, and how appropriate after all. This is ancient man, and these people presumably would have made cave paintings, and they're leaving Earth, but at the same time, the last view they see of the beloved fauna which they have hunted and lived with is a sort of a reproduction of the side of their cave at home. As they move away and up and gain altitude, the depth of field available to their eyes becomes more irrelevant, and the scene before them looks like it's plastered up against a wall. So it's a neat little side of this, an extra dimension to the scene that I wasn't expecting when I first constructed it. Now, as I lay in the tendons and joints of the horse's legs, I'm tantalizingly close to finished on these horses. So you're going to see me go back and forth a lot, just finding details, finding contours to focus the image more and more all the time. I'll give some shin bones or tendons here and there. Then I'll outline a hoof, and then I'll move over and fiddle with some other shape. But you don't see, but I have a whole palette of background colors, foreground colors, and intermediate colors at the ready, so that anytime I need to pull an extra detail to finish the form, it's right there for me. These colors have been sitting on the palette for a couple hours now, and they're still fresh, but you don't want to go too long and let the colors firm up or get gooey or stringy. You want them to be more or less fresh, kind of like you want food to be fresh at a buffet. The fresher it is, the better it is. So right now I've just got a nice palette of paint. I've got darks, I've got lights, and everything in between, so I can finish the horse up with by just reaching over and grabbing what I need. It's my favorite time of the painting, when I don't have to lay in a lot of chunks of color. I'm just finding those things that I need to pull the picture into focus. You'll notice that I'm doing a lot of carving of the form by means of the background color, using, I guess it's a synthetic Da Vinci Topacryl brush right now that I'm using. It's got a nice firm bristle, yet soft, and I can push that background color and
kind of squeegee the color right up to the edges of the forms, give a little bit of simultaneous contrast, a little bit of sharp, hard whites that are bordering the form. And again, I'm even adjusting the body language slightly as I go, even into the final stages, though careful not to get too rigid and tight, not to firm things up to where I interfere with the dynamism of their motion. So right now I'm just pulling some chips of background over top the limbs, bordering the limbs, strengthening them where they need to be strengthened, leaving them blurry where they need to be blurry to better express flight.